fancy thing. I just want to. Should I stand here? Sorry, there's a camera taking a. Oh, yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for coming. So I've noticed that Vuiswa like saying Mr. So and so. And I apparently have a very serious disposition. So people tend to say Mr. Zibi a lot. So they send, when I get direct messages on social media, they are very formal. They say, "Dear Mr. Zibi." So please call me Songes. No Mr. Zibi here. But good morning, and thanks very much for being here today. So I'm just going to make a few points. The reason I've got my phone here, it's a stopwatch so that I stick to time. So I will not speak more than an hour. I'll only speak I'll only speak for about 10 minutes, and then I will sit down so that Mandla can do his thing. So I think when we thought about what we're doing now, one of the answers we were to answer several questions. Let me put it like that. How do we understand the problem in South Africa, and how do we get to understand the problems properly? Firstly, secondly, how do we think about solutions to those problems, and thirdly, what sort of policy framework or at least political philosophy might assist us in getting to solutions on that basis. And that is understanding that there are certain things that stay as they are. For instance, we have a constitution in South Africa. We are not some of these people who say the constitution must be tossed out, it needs to be wholly rewritten because it doesn't work and so on. That's not our position. We are constitutionalists insofar as we believe that if you want to amend the constitution, you must use the instruments that are available in the constitution to make, I think, what I believe would be the 17th or 18th or 19th amendment going forward for a very specific reason, following the processes that are allowed in the constitution. So that is the first thing. The second thing, we have made a choice that the preamble and chapter 2 of the Constitution are particularly important to us in guiding us where we go. And that is because the preamble of our Constitution really takes account of where we are and where we come from. So it's where we come from, where we are as a country, and the kind of country we need to create. The Bill of Rights of the Constitution really establishes the rights that South Africans and anyone who is a human being who is here in South Africa should have. And therefore that sets the guardrails of how we think about solutions. So for instance, we're not going to, out of a frustration with violent crime, say, okay, we must flog people in public and we must have the death penalty. No. Understand the crime problem, its origins, its dynamics, whether they are social or socio-economic and so on, and devise solutions that are constitutional, are within the realm of the Constitution. So that's important to establish upfront. And I think we do not have enough people who defend the Constitution. We have a lot of people who are noisy and attack the Constitution when where we have failed as a country is that we have failed to live up to what the Constitution says that we should do as a society. So that is the principle that I want to establish at the onset. The second thing that I want to say is to offer both a criticism and maybe help us to understand how we then think about solutions. And that is, I think, one of the views that we hold, and how I hold particularly personally, is that what we have had so far is effectively an interim arrangement. And that interim arrangement was to secure the peace in 1994. We were an extremely violent country. We are now again, but for different reasons, but we're an extremely violent country. And if you recall, there was something called the Concerned South Africans Group, which involved people who didn't want an election, and there was lots of violence and so on, right? and we had to ensure that we guarantee minority rights, for instance. And so we ended up with a proportional representation system. But that meant you had to do a trade-off, which is, at the time, you're not going to worry about constituencies and that sort of thing, because the important thing is that globally, in terms of South Africa's people, everybody feels represented in this thing. Well, it's kind of not working out so well now. And we do need to think about how we fix that. So when we talk about political reform, it's that and some of the other problems that arise from that system. For instance, the amount of executive discretionary power that is there that forces some organizations to go to court because the executive have simply decided to do something or appoint someone like a national director of public prosecutions at some point, which was declared irrational, and so on. So we have to ask these questions at this point in South Africa's democracy. Does it still work? Were the assumptions made in 1994 and in the 1996 Constitution still true? What is our experience over the last 29 years? Can we say everything is perfect? The only thing that's wrong is the people. You remove the people, then you don't have a problem. If we take that position, it means we will always go through these cycles of people that eventually get corrupted by a defective system. And therefore we get the kind of problems that we do. So the political reform program is really important for how we understand taking power back to the people. How do we make sure that parliament is adequately representative, actually? And therefore, what powers should parliament have versus the executive and so on? What level of transparency do you need in the democracy itself? So that's one example of why the reset is needed. Otherwise, we build the problems around people. We will never get Madiba again, and the arms deal started in Madiba's time. So you can see that even with some of the best regarded people in power, you still have problems in any case. So you've got to look at your system so that the democracy is functional. So that is the one example that I want to make. The second thing is as a general point to make is that we've also tended to rely a lot on the force of personality in politics and also political parties themselves. So the anchor to South African society has tended to be political parties. When people say, oh, but there's no leadership in South Africa, there is leadership in South Africa. There's lots of leadership in civil society, in the church and so on. These are the people who've been basically dealing with the fallout of a defective political system. What people effectively mean, I think, is that the political system is broken because those are the people that end up in the union buildings. But otherwise, in various other spheres of society, there are still people that you can trust, you can rely on, but they don't have sufficient power to change that because political power matters. But I also want to talk about the intangible. And yesterday I made an example about load shedding and crime, and I will make that example again if you didn't hear me. And that is, it is not so much that we have load shedding. It is the feeling that we've lost the ability to put an end to it. We've lost that ability. You know that thing that makes you confident that if I start fixing something, I will fix it. That confidence is gone. That confidence is gone. It is the sense that we can't do anything about crime, actually. We can't do anything about crime. We don't trust the police. We don't trust the politicians who head up the police. We don't trust the police commissioners because since George Fivers, we haven't had a national police commissioner who lasts a full term. There is a problem with them. These things are demotivating to the soul of a country, right? So what really brings us together? Is it the Constitution, but have we simplified that Constitution so that people understand that morally these are the things I agree with and so on, or that resonate with me, right? So it's important that we have that discussion. And in the documents that you see in those folders, we've attempted an interpretation, therefore, of the South African soul and the Constitution. And we believe that the South African Constitution is a social democratic constitution. At least the values in our Constitution are social democratic. And so let's talk about those values, and I think they resonate with most of us. They are equality, they are freedom, they are justice, they are solidarity. And in our context, we've added a fifth one, which is integrity. And with the benefit of experience over the last 30 years, we realize integrity is very important. But I must tell you, integrity alone is not enough. You need a system that is built to assist those with integrity, or to sift those without integrity out of the system, and so on. So that's the second point I want to speak to. And the last point I want to speak to is really how, in the frame, and hopefully when we have the discussion with Mandla, we're going to show how we understand the problems, how we think about solutions, and what it means for in terms of the solution. So let me just make an example around the importance of orientation. So one of the most popular discussions in South Africa, at least on social media, is the climate change conversation, specifically in the context of Eskom and renewable contracts and that sort of thing. That's what dominates discussion. And this is not surprising, because you've got a clash of the elites about economic interests in that context. What do I mean? So I used to work in mining. There is a saying in mining that good mines are not sold, they are bought. Anybody who's flogging a mine, there's a problem with it, either now or a little bit later down the road. And that's what happened to coal mines, because as the whole environmental climate change issue became topical internationally, various investment funds started putting pressure on mining companies to ditch coal. And so there's a lot of coal companies that are available to black owners and black investors. And what happens as a result of the change in global policy, the government changes the rules, right? To say we need to transition and so on. And so you now have these two elite interests fighting, because on the one hand, they are lucrative renewable contracts. On the other hand, there are investors on the other side who are increasingly black, who are now going to lose trucking contracts, coal contracts to Eskom, and so on. Who gets forgotten? And this is where the orientation is important. It's the people in my village who used, like my family, we used to turn the soil in October, we turn it again in November, and we plant. And when the maize is that tall, we start weeding just before Christmas. And we have the first fruit at the end of March, beginning of April, and we harvest at the end of June, towards the middle of July. That was a cycle. Climate has changed now. It rains at wrong times of the year. Guess what we still do? We still cultivate at around the same time. What is the yield? The yield is almost nothing. So it means the livelihoods of people are threatened. We talk about floods in KZN. What happens there? People's homes get swept away. An entire lifetime of sweat and blood to build a home, it's gone in no time. Third example, people in the Highveld, in the coal belt, are suffering from respiratory illnesses because of the power stations there. So what does this conversation do? It says they should not matter. Let's just carry on. So the first point about orientation is centering real people at the placing the issues of real human beings, not just people as a body, human beings at the center of political consideration, political action, legislation, policy making, and so on. Because you can literally imagine a human being, a person dealing with a problem, and you ask yourself, how do I solve that problem for that person? Then that's compassionate policy making, that's compassionate legislation. As you balance the different interests in society, you continue to center human beings at the center of that. Now you can say you are also fulfilling the value of justice, because you're doing it in a just way. You're doing it in a way that cares for people. So that's one example. The second and last example, because I'm out of time, our chair is very strident with time. The second and last example I am going to make has got to do, and I will relate a personal experience from where I come from. So my village is called Zwelicha, but in the books it's called Khohlo. So there are lots of youngsters in my village who are in prison. And when I say youngsters, I mean under the age of 20. So they're effectively adolescents. So usually they drop out of school, they get into alcohol and drug abuse, alcohol or drug abuse or both. Then there's a fight at the tavern or on the way back from there and that sort of thing. A murder happens in that way, an attempted murder, etc., etc. This has become very common. And so they are in prison. And depending on whether the victim was killed or injured, nearly killed, it's either attempted murder or murder itself. So they now go into the maximum section of the prison. But they're kids. And now they come out of prison before they're 30. And they're unemployed, right? They've lost out on school already. And in terms of South African law, they are violent criminals. We've got a rehabilitative system, but they're still considered to not have been rehabilitated. So they've got a criminal record. So they can never find work. Okay. So they go back to crime. And they go back to all of this kind of problems. So we recycle this whole thing. But let's go back to the reasons even for the drug problem. Destruction of community structures, family structures, because a mother, a single mother like my mother, has to go and work somewhere and not be a parent, because it's either food on the table or being a parent. So they choose food on the table. That's one example. But let me just focus on the drug and alcohol problem. Is it a health issue? Is it a crime issue? Or is it a socio-economic issue? Or is it all three? So let's think about how the clusters in government work. You've got a security cluster, an economic cluster, and a social cluster. Where do you locate this in those clusters? So do the clusters really work? Okay, they don't. Because Bheki is going to go there and deal with this in his usual manner, which is stomach in, chest out, shoot first and ask questions later. You're not solving the problem. Or we're going to have a yes program. But the yes program says, no, you are a criminal. You're not part of it. So you shut those people out of the system, right? And then we say, oh, but youth unemployment and all of these problems. Business is not doing enough and so on, but the statutes don't even let you do anything. So what am I trying to say in closing? One of the things we are attempting to do here is to reorientate how we understand some of these problems, their origin, and how we therefore design solutions which respond to real situation on the ground. That's what we mean. And I think under those circumstances, people would feel that the democracy is responding adequately to the issues that matter to them the most, because we are a listening democracy. But a listening democracy cannot be left to individual choices to listen or parties to listen. You must build active listening into the system to force the structures to listen to people and take account of their needs, their preferences, their circumstances properly, apply the data and the science, and give solutions which are responsive, that people can participate in, rather than patronizing them and saying, this is our manifesto, we will do it for you, but we've got these clusters that don't work. By that, I'm hoping I've explained the thinking of how we think about solutions. Some of the conversation we're going to have, I haven't made all the examples. I've also given a sense of what we mean by taking democracy back to the people and making it responsive as a second point. And thirdly, why we are going to have a people's manifesto process. Because people formulate the problem in a particular way. The bureaucracy and the political system formulate it in another way. And the bureaucracy and the political system keep quiet while the people talk, and then it walks away to do it in the same way that it's always done before. And that's one of the things we're trying to change in the political and the democratic culture. Thank you.